Number 7, The Gifted. Alright, so next up is what might be the most controversial video in this entire series, best or worst. There's going to be some debate to that, and there are going to be some other controversial ones on this list. But The Gifted is unique in that it's the only title across any of the series we're going to be talking about in any of the media that stood an honest-to-God chance of having a spot on both the best of and worst of list. Yeah, The Gifted got a lot of votes on the best of list and came 15th overall. That's just one place behind The Flash Show, which was one of the honorable mentions I had talked about in the Mr. Miracle video that kicked off this series. Now that says a lot about this show right from the start. To me, it really indicates that this thing is polarizing. A show that a lot of people like and a lot of people don't like. It also means that enough people were following the show, initially from its run that started in 2017, into Season 1, which ended in 2018, and the beginning of Season 2, which also premiered last year. All of that is to say The Gifted was resistant to the Walking Dead effect, meaning that enough people still care about The Gifted that something happened during those episodes in 2018 to turn them off of the show, and not only that, but identify it as a particularly weak television show relative to some of the other superhero shows out there these days. And that's a real shame because on the surface, The Gifted is a pretty remarkable show, trying some interesting things that really had some potential. I have to say, I am one of those people that lost interest in The Gifted pretty early on from Season 1, and stopped watching the show back in 2017. So for me, as a function of this mini-series, I've been catching up on these episodes over the last few days, and I have to say, I've been enjoying them, at least at first. The tail end of Season 1 was a lot of fun. It picked up on some interesting things, had some interesting parts going to it, but it's a very cool show in one sense. Blink, Warpath's brother Thunderbird, the Stepford Cuckoos, Polaris, all pretty well cast as well, top to bottom with a lot of potential. The Strucker family is a cool way of getting us into this whole show, and the refugee angle for the X-Men feels like a very natural fit that really works in today's climate. But the budget really holds this show back more than anything else, severely restricting the powers and abilities of these characters to the extent that everything feels horribly watered down. I get why they had to do this. I understand that there's limits to TV shows, but compared to other shows out there that depict superheroes, The Gifted is really lacking in this regard. And it feels like the power and abilities of these mutants, which should be this big thing that the government's all afraid of, is very weak sauce compared to what we're used to out of the X-Men comics. The writing also leaves a lot to be desired. From start to finish, the episodes in 2018 from The Gifted are full of cliched lines, unnecessary drama points, flat humor, annoying, weird references to the X-Men with the full knowledge and intention of never showing any of them ever. And while there's a lot of ambition in the writing, great ideas and cool concepts, the budget, direction, dialogue, and production have a lot of trouble living up to all of it. This dialogue in particular is a real issue, full of awkward, dumb, and silly lines. It's all over the place, but also very sporadic. Sometimes the writing's very clever, other times it's outright goofy. It's heavy on cliché to the great disservice of the show. For example, in Season 1 they cover tropes ranging from prison to experimentation to tragic villain complex to a major whammy with the son lashing out against the father, the cast being divided out. Just felt like this big cliched sandwich. And then we descend into Season 2, and I think that's where the real problem set in, because it's filled with forced drama and filler. It even cropped up in the season finale of Season 1, which is not a good sign because usually that's the tightest written concepts, and it kind of is for the show. Elements of it are great. The tail end of Season 1 did actually pique my interest again, to the extent I was worried that I would be disagreeing with this show's placement on this top 10 list. But I could definitely pick out weaknesses even from Season 1, and as we got into Season 2, I started to really understand why so many people voted for this being one of the worst stories in 2018. The overall premise of the show could be cool, but the way they treat the X-Men as these big legendary figures, but always unseen and just sort of this ethereal presence that people have this weird faith in, feels wonky and cheap. And no matter how strong we get, with appearances from the Hellfire Club or references to Genosha, an awesome opening to Season 2, it's hard to escape the overall burden of the Fox take on the X-Men. Bryan Singer's presence is still felt in this show somehow, and it drags everything down to a strong degree. And the shame of it all is I see so much potential here. The idea of this family and these mutants having to live like refugees fits well with seeing some of the Morlocks and the Purifiers in action, but the show gets boring very quickly in Season 2. The preponderance of flashbacks doesn't really help, it makes everything feel old hat. In fact, everything about this show feels like it's 15 years too old. And no matter how many new cool plot lines that the Season 2 introduces, it ends up feeling dragged out and just nothing but filler, until presumably the Season 2 will end this year with some pretty interesting stuff. But I don't think that really excuses this show. The fact that Season 2 and the 2018 episodes are just such a big dragged out drama fest really pulls everything down in a pretty serious way. Take this former agent character turned private mutant hunter in Season 2. He becomes more and more unsympathetic as he becomes attached to these Purifiers, and we start to see this side of him that makes him just this straight up nutjob, this fascist bootlicker who's attacking these mutants that really just want to exist in private. And I get why this is happening. The show does a good job at depicting how the society changed after this horrible mutant event that happened called 715 or something like that. That all feels really dated. The refugee angle, the more interesting aspects of these characters, that stuff could be cool, but the show feels like it's failing that aspect of it time and time again. Look, I love the fact that we have a show with Polaris and all these other often overlooked mutant characters, but it feels like that show isn't living up to it. I'm a big fan of Blink, but seeing her in a show like this doesn't exactly endear me to the show anymore. If anything, as an X-Men fan and a fan of these characters, it just annoys me all the more. But all these things kind of make the show imperfect, flawed, but not necessarily a deal breaker. I could see why people thought the show is great and would vote for it as being one of the best of in 2018. Were it not for something that really kicks in around episode 4 or 5 of Season 2. And that problem is actually a huge bane of a lot of other shows, and is a bit of a recurring problem for TV shows that seem to get a lot of worst of votes this year. And that's a concept called serialization. Now, serialization in and of itself doesn't necessarily damage a show. If anything, compared to the more episodic nature of old-style television, serialization has a lot to offer. It's how television shows such as Breaking Bad or Battlestar Galactica were popular, and in turn, it's how that sort of storytelling basically took over all of television in more recent years. But I have to tell you, while serialization is almost necessary for superhero shows that need these overarching plots to sort of build up towards things and to sort of create this ongoing sense of canon, it's killing a lot of these TV shows in a big way. Take another show that got a lot of worst of votes but not quite enough to make it into the top 10, Supergirl. Now this is an awesome show with a great cast, just like The Gifted, but honestly, I personally voted for it to be one of the worst of in the top 10 this year, because it's being dragged down by serialization so badly. Last season's take on Reign in particular is a good example of how serialization can damage a show, basically stretching out a villain who really would only be good for a handful of episodes at most into an entire season's worth of episodes. Even the relatively shorter nature of The Gifted compared to Supergirl really drags this stuff down in a big way. I can summarize most of what Season 2 is all about with the idea of it being the Hellfire Club, and the mutants being divided up over that sort of thing, and dealing with that, while we get more into the Morlocks and the Purifiers and all of that sort of thing. It's interesting stuff in and of itself, but we waste so much time dealing with the Strucker kid now being on the Hellfire side, and the family dealing with that and fighting with each other over that, and on, over so many scenes and episodes that it makes the viewing experience awful and boring. Serialization is actively killing The Gifted, making each episode feel like it has less to offer on its own. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with making the whole arc of this season be about the Hellfire Club. That's okay. But if they wanted to do that, then the Hellfire Club should have more members, it should have individual episodes dealing with the renegade underground mutants, dealing with each of these Hellfire Club members, so that each episode kind of feels like it has something to offer. Maybe one mutant has a cool fire power and they have to go up against him, then they have to go up against another one, but this time Polaris is there trying to help out the Hellfire Club, so they confront her. You can still have these ongoing serialization elements to your episode, but you need to be clever about it and make sure that we're getting something to offer in each episode. And shows like The Gifted or Supergirl are lacking in this regard, and it's making those shows actively worse. You should pay attention to this concept as it applies to the best of 2018 list when it comes to certain superhero television shows, because a lot of those shows excel at making each episode individually entertaining and individually having a lot to offer. But next up on the best of list is actually going to be a movie, a really good movie that's worth talking about and I'm excited to get into as we go deeper into the best of 2018 list as decided by our viewers. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. I'm sure people are going to have a lot of opinions about this one, but I gotta tell you guys, I hear you out. I really enjoyed aspects of The Gifted, but I understand where people are coming from when they say this is one of the worst stories told this year. You can have a cool story, but if you drag it out too much, it becomes a pretty miserable experience. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.